Hey, it's Brett, and this is They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery. This is Chapter 1, Ferguson, A City Holds Its Breath. The first time I saw the name Michael Brown was on Instagram. I typically checked Instagram once or twice a week to see old college friends partying, or journalism colleagues posting from airports en route to an assignment. As I scrolled through my feed on the afternoon of August 9th, my fingers stopped when I reached a series of videos uploaded by Brittany Noble, a local news reporter in St. Louis, whom I consider an older sister. The clip showed a disheveled woman crying, screaming and crying. The police, she said, had killed her firstborn son. Over her shoulder, a crowd had gathered. I first met Brittany, as she always teasingly insisted we pronounce it, at one of the annual gatherings of the National Association of Black Journalists. We were then both job-hungry college students and hit it off quick while discussing the feedback we'd received on our resumes from recruiters and comparing invites to the conference's nightly receptions. 5 years later, we remained part of a core group of friends from whom these conferences, who stayed in semi-frequent touch as we tried to navigate entry-level journalism jobs. Brittany had graduated a few years earlier than me, and after bouncing around several smaller market television stations, she settled into a gig with KMOV, the CBS affiliate in St. Louis, which was both her hometown and that of her fiancé Mike. As they prepared for the wedding, they decided to live in a racially diverse town not far away from the city, Ferguson. 2 years after taking the gig in Missouri, Brittany was working on weekends, giving her Friday nights to the job, and then, after a few hours of sleep, heading back out into the field for early Saturday and Sunday morning live shots. It's the type of thankless work done by many young reporters, but she was glad to be back home. The only thing bigger than Brittany's smile is her drive, and that ambition meant she was often looking for a way to stand out on the job, constantly searching for a small scoop or a neighborhood feature that her competition might have overlooked. It didn't hurt that she had connections. Her mother, before she retired, had been one of the highest-ranking black women on the history of the St. Louis Police Department. Her soon-to-be father-in-law ran a prominent black church in the city. On many days, Brittany's email and voicemail were full of story tips and ideas. Not all of the leads panned out, but it wasn't rare for her to come up with a unique angle or tidbit. Much like my own experience at the Globe, working general assignment can be a mixed bag. One day you're covering a high school graduation, the next you're camped out beside crime scene tape. And then, of course, there are the officer-involved shootings. Brittany's first came on July 1st, 2012, as her first job at a station in Saginaw, Michigan. A homeless black man, Milton Hall, had been shot and killed by the police in the parking lot of a shopping plaza. The officers responded to a 911 call about a man who had stolen a cup of coffee from a convenience store. When they arrived, they encountered Hall, who was carrying a knife, and they began to argue with him. The 49-year-old had a history of mental illness and had been living on the street. 8 officers reported to the scene, and they told investigators that when they arrived, Hall threatened a female officer with a knife and closed within a few feet of her. After a standoff of several minutes, the officers, who had formed a semicircle around Hall as he staggered forward, opened fire. With traffic driving past and several bystanders in the parking lot, the officers shot 47 bullets in total, with 11 of them riddling Hall's body. The shooting was caught on cell phone video and soon was playing on loop on CNN. The community was outraged. They said they were going to protest and demonstrate, and blow the whole place up if the officers didn't get indicted, Brittany recalled to me later. And then the officers didn't get indicted and nothing happened. Before Ferguson, this storyline was as common as it was hidden. A community flies into rage after a questionable police shooting. Leaders hold vigils and marches. Figureheads call for accountability, and then, almost as quickly as the tragedy began, it ends. Everyone but the grieving family moves on with their lives until the next time a radio dispatcher puts out the call, "Need backup, shots fired, officer involved." When that call came on an August 9th, 2014, Brittany was in St. Louis. Having worked the early morning Saturday shift, she was across town preparing for her engagement photo shoot. "Hey, Brittany, you see that police shot somebody in Ferguson?" Her fiancé called out before handing her the phone so she could see for herself. Perhaps he was already tiring of the engagement photos because he knew full and well what would happen next. In an industry dominated by white reporters and editors, young black journalists are told early and often that they've got to go above and beyond, showing up unasked for a weekend shift, coming in early and staying late on the weekdays, and always being ready at a moment's notice to drop everything and run toward the story. For 2 years, that was what Brittany, one of the only black reporters at her station and one of just a few in St. Louis, a major media market, had been doing. She often felt overlooked or underappreciated, but if she kept doing her job, if she kept chasing and getting the story, she knew they couldn't ignore her and her work forever. Brittany fired off an email to her bosses asking if they had anyone headed to the scene. When they didn't respond, she called the producer directly. "You need me to come in?" she asked. Minutes later, she landed the first major scoop of Ferguson, the emotional reaction of Michael Brown's mother as she arrived at the scene. As Brittany raced across town, residents of the Canfield Green apartment complex began flooding the streets. The shooting had happened on a quiet side street in a spot surrounded by 4-level apartment buildings. As the crowds gathered, others took to windows and porches, looking down at the chaos developing below. Within minutes after the shooting, word spread through the surrounding apartments and beyond that Brown's hands were up in the air when the fatal shots were fired by Officer Darren Wilson, who had encountered Brown and his friend Dorian Johnson while responding to a call about 2 young men, matching their description, who had just been involved in the robbery of a nearby liquor store. As police officers scrambled to secure the scene, an enraged, agitated crowd was quickly gathering. Why is Brown's body still out there? Why was he shot and killed in the first place? And why do we keep hearing that he had his hands up? "Get us several more units over here," one of the responding officers demanded over the police radio. "There's going to be a problem." Johnson and Brown had entered Ferguson Market and Liquor at 11:53 that morning, with Brown, the younger of the 2 men, grabbing a $34 box of Swisher Sweets and attempting to walk out. The employee working behind the counter that day told Brown that he had to pay for the smokes, and in response the teen grabbed the man by the collar and shoved him. One of the store's security cameras captured the violent exchange, an 11-second video clip that would be the last living image of Brown. But in the hours and days after Brown was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson, none of the residents of Ferguson knew about the liquor store robbery. That information wouldn't come out for days when the still frame images from surveillance cameras were released by Ferguson PD. In fact, in those early days, police refused to release any information or answer any question of substance. Why had Brown been shot and killed? Who was the officer involved? What was the potential threat to the officer that prompted his use of deadly force? but a vacuum of information always finds a way to be filled, especially in a crowded apartment complex full of dozens of people who claim to have seen the struggle and the shooting. The Canfield Green apartments are a cluster of half a dozen cream-colored buildings with green and brown trim. The 37-acre complex contains more than 414 apartments, one- and two-bedroom units, for which Canfield's almost exclusively black residents fork over about $500 a month. It's a relatively low-income sliver of Ferguson, a city that is socioeconomically diverse. Residents complain of gang activity, break-ins, and of their ears too frequently seizing at the sharp cackle of gunshots. During my first days on the ground in Ferguson, many Canfield residents believed that Brown, after being confronted by Wilson for jaywalking, had been shot in the back as he ran away. Dorian Johnson, Brown's friend who was with him when he was killed, claimed that after an initial struggle and gunfire, Brown ran away from Wilson, turned around, put his hands up, and shouted, "Don't shoot!" Johnson ran away from Brown, and Wilson began struggling, ducking behind a nearby vehicle as the fatal shots were fired. An even more inflammatory rumor, later proven untrue, was soon circulating throughout Ferguson that when Officer Wilson had stood over Brian's dying body and fired an execution shot into the dying teen's chest. For many of those first nights after Brown's death, people believed that there was a video of the shooting, with rumors flying that officers had seized residents' cell phones to keep the videos from spreading, and there was anger about the number of bullets fired by Wilson. Why would Wilson need to shoot Mike Brown 6 times? Why didn't he have a taser? Why did it take so long for Brown's body to be moved from the ground? I could see how the officer could be intimidated, but that ain't a reason to be gunned down. Not 9 times, not with your hands up, said Dwayne Finney, 36, a childhood friend of Brown's father and friend of the family, who was one of the first people I interviewed after arriving in Ferguson. I just put myself in Mike's shoes and your last seconds of life, you're getting executed by somebody who's supposed to protect and serve you. People are tired of being misused and mistreated, and this is an outlet for them to express their outrage and anger. Everybody is looking for an outlet to express their emotions, he told me August 11th, 2 days after the shooting. This is a reason. All the looting and what's going on now, but people want to be heard, and they don't know how to do it, so that's why they lash out. They're not trying to let this one get swept under the table, a friend of Finney's, who had been standing alongside him while we spoke, chimed in. Investigators would later conclude that Brown's hands were most likely not up at the time, and the altercation began when the 18-year-old punched Darren Wilson after the officer, responding to the robbery call, attempted to stop him on the street. Whether Brown was attempting to surrender or attempting to attack Officer Wilson when the fatal shots were fired remains murky. The evidence shows that "Hands up, don't shoot," a national rallying cry, the chief chorus of the Dead Boys Defenders, was based on a falsehood. But as anger boiled into rage, no one in Ferguson could have known that yet. They did know that the police in Ferguson looked nothing like them, an almost all-white force charged with serving and protecting a majority black city. They knew all too well about the near-constant traffic tickets they were being given and how often those tickets turned into warrants. And they knew that Mike, the quiet kid who got his hair cut up the street on West Florissant and who was often seen walking around in this neighborhood, was dead. "That could have been any of us. That could have been me dead on the street," screamed Carl Union, 27, a local DJ who refused to leave one of the early protests despite multiple rounds of heavy tear gas. Union said that when he saw the images of Brown's body in the street, he thought of his young daughter. When he heard that Brown had been shot by the police, he became angry and decided to join the protest. "It's like we're not even human to them," Union said through tears. Mike Brown's body remained on the hot August ground for 4.5 hours, a gruesome, dehumanizing spectacle that further traumatized the residents of Canfield Drive and would later be cited by local police officers as among their major mistakes. For some, first in Ferguson and later around the nation, the spectacle of Brown's body cooling on the asphalt conjured images of the historic horrors of lynchings, the black body of a man robbed of his right to due process and placed on display as a warning to other black residents. If the police were willing to not only kill Mike Brown, residents of Canfield Drive would ask me as I interviewed them, but also let his body sit out that way, what would they be willing to do to the rest of us? Within an hour of the shooting, word had traveled to Michael Brown's family. His mother, stepfather, and father, who each individually made their way to Canfield Drive. Police had sealed off the block, causing a bottleneck of dozens, and eventually hundreds of people who began to gather at the corner of West Florissant Avenue. That's where Brittany and the videographer she had with her parked their news van, and where she first approached Leslie McSpadden, the boy's mother. Another reporter at Brittany's station was supposed to interview the family, so initially Brittany focused on getting reaction quotes from enraged local residents. But Brown's mother was standing just a few feet away and didn't look like any of the reporters were talking to her. Finally, Brittany asked one of the residents she had interviewed, a cousin of Brown's, if he would make an introduction. Initially, she didn't even bring her cameraman with her, assuming that her colleague had already interviewed the dead teen's mother. Instead, Brittany thought, she'd upload the video to Instagram, since that's where she had first heard the story. "You didn't have to shoot him 8 times, McSpadden exclaimed to Brittany. "You just shot all through my baby's body." Brittany ended up working late into the night, transmitting live shots for every newscast, ending with the 11:30 p.m., and watching as the crowds that gathered became more and more frustrated and angry. The Ferguson and St. Louis County Police had sent scores of officers, some in full riot gear and tactical vehicles, to deal with the growing crowds and to hold them back as they attempted to investigate for themselves the scene of the shooting. All of this is pretty standard for the scene of a police shooting. Police, protesters, angered residents and families, but the scale of the immediate response from both the community and law enforcement signaled that perhaps Ferguson would be different. This was a scene that I had never seen before, a heartbreak that I had never felt before from the people I was interviewing, Brittany later told me. I just felt different. Something wasn't right. This wasn't the typical police shooting scene. And then after 4 hours, as midday turned to late afternoon, officers finally removed Brown's body from the asphalt. They did not address the crowds who were hungry for answers after spending most of their Saturday hearing inflammatory rumors. People were all like, "After all that, they're just going to leave?" Brittany said. "They're not going to say anything? These people were hurt." As the police began to leave, church groups started walking down Canfield Drive, following the still hysterical Leslie McSpadden to the spot where crimson blood still stained the ground. When they arrived, the group circled around McSpadden and her husband and began to pray, sing, and hug. Some were older folks from the church up the road. Others were younger residents who poured out of the Canfield apartments. What had been a rambunctious crowd had composed itself to create a vigil for a violent death. But the tranquility didn't last. As the prayer group began to break up, the residents of Canfield began to yell. Prayer wasn't going to fix this. Neither was singing. The police had to answer for this. Why was Mike Brown dead? Why had his body been left out for so long? And when would we get answers? Amid the shouting, someone lit a dumpster on fire. While moments earlier, desperate prayers were being sent above, now it was the flash of flames floating into the night air. Ferguson survived that first night. The dumpster fire and the sound of distant gunshots spooked police, but they were nothing with what compared with what was to come. The following day, the police department still hadn't explained what had happened or apologized for keeping Brown's body out on the ground for so long. And church groups were calling for a march in the slain teen's honor. That Sunday afternoon, after services concluded, local pastors and their flocks met at the spot where Brown was killed. Hundreds showed up, surrounding newly erected memorials made of candles, stuffed animals, and liquor bottles that together overflowed the grass shoulders on either side of the two-lane road. The crowd started marching and chanting, for the first time, what they believed to be Michael Brown's last words in his final moments. "Hands up! Don't shoot!" The cries rang into the air as the crowd, including many students, began to set to begin school the next week, as well as middle-aged residents of the apartment complex moved forward. As they hit West Florissant and turned left, they were met by a wall of police officers. Soon what had begun as a peaceful march had morphed into a heated standoff, blocking traffic in both directions. The scene played out right in front of Brittany, who, after spending Saturday night on the job, woke up for her 5 a.m. live shot, worked a full day shift, and was again at the corner of Canfield Drive in West Florissant, watching her community clash with police. Night was close. The crowd continued shouting at the officers, who were shouting back. As the church groups began to leave, young men emerged who seemed angrier and more determined to extract revenge for Mike Brown's death. Brittany made her way toward the front of the demonstration to the spot where the crowd was standing toe-to-toe with the police. A young girl, perhaps in her early teens, ran up and grabbed Brittany's arm, a look of terror in her eyes. "They knocked the windows out of your truck," the girl screamed, "and now they're burning the Quick Trip." Brittany turned to see the shattered glass of the news station van scattered across the ground, and as she moved toward it, she could see men running in and out of the Quick Trip gas station at the corner of West Florissant Avenue and North Winds Estates Drive. It's unclear how it started, but in the swirl of misinformation and confusion, some in the neighborhood had started spreading the word that the 911 to call report a robbery by Michael Brown was made by the employees at this gas station. They most likely had confused the gas station with the liquor store up the street. That night, armed vandals took advantage of raging protests and demonstrations to break into the Quick Trip gas station that sat just a block away from the spot on Canfield Drive where Brown was killed, grabbing handfuls of chips and soda, cigarettes and lighters as others ripped the ATM machine from the wall. Before long, the store was ablaze. While the photos and videos from the day of Brown's death had certainly gone viral, viewed and shared thousands of times, it was the destruction of the Quick Trip, not the police shooting of Mike Brown, that brought the microscope of the national media to Ferguson. The unrest in Ferguson had now become a riot. Yet another police shooting in a working-class black neighborhood, even the breaking of a young black body left on public display, didn't catch the gaze of the national media. It was the community's enraged response, broken windows and shattered storefronts, that drew the eyes of the nation. Most of the so-called race riots of the 1800s and the early 1900s consisted of armed clashes between white and black residents, often precipitated by a black man or woman being somewhere that black folks didn't belong. That began to change in the 1930s. The large-scale racial conflicts that began in 1935 consisted primarily not of white Klansmen and residents ransacking black homes and businesses, but of black men and women lashing out with violence against symbols of the white establishment, businesses, storefronts, and government buildings. And of the more than 100 such race riots since 1935, almost all have been sparked by some type of police incident. Between the two world wars, Harlem was believed to be the shining gold standard of what a post-racial Renaissance city could look like, the nation's capital of black culture and society, full of neighborhoods with relatively peaceful integration of blacks, whites, and immigrants. But so much like almost a century later, in the Obama years, to think that Harlem was then some sort of post-racial mecca required a willed ignorance of the deep racial inequalities baked into the American experience. The end of the Harlem Renaissance had a post-racial zeitgeist never seen before, which caused its own set of anxieties for both black and white residents. Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the then director of the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, who was written at length about race riots, told me not long after Ferguson. The truth is, it was in commercial establishments, like the neighborhood dime store, where there was a level of integration and race mixing, a decade after the Great Migration, that had never been seen before, which meant there was a lot of racial tension. On the afternoon of March 19, 1935, Lino Rivera, a 16-year-old black Puerto Rican boy, was caught stealing a penknife from S.H. Kress, a dime store across the street from the storied Apollo Theater. In the time it took for the police to arrive, a crowd had gathered outside the storefront. The owner asked the police to let Rivera go, but no one told the crowds that police officers had quietly slipped the teen out the store's side door. And a vacuum of information. A story spread that a young black boy had been killed for stealing a piece of candy and that the police were hiding his body. A hearse just happened to pull up and park nearby. The crowd assumed the worst. More than 10,000 black residents took to the Harlem streets, with some smashing storefront windows and later getting in fights with the white New York Police Department officers who arrived to break up the violent assembly. Police, despite their numbers, were handicapped in dealing with the rioters by the necessity of guarding the windowless stores. A reporter for the New York Daily News wrote the next day, "Looting of stores was the objective of hundreds of hoodlums who swarmed into the district from Manhattan and the Bronx after news of the riots spread. Burglar alarms and false alarms were ringing constantly in the district, and fires were being set in several looted stores." By the time the rioting had concluded, a day later, 125 people had been arrested, 3 people were dead, and more than $2 million of damage had been done to local businesses. As is almost always the case after the type of unrest commonly called an race riot, local officials quickly appointed commissions and review boards to tease out what had caused chaos. Multiple such commissions were created to examine the 1935 unrest in Harlem. They all concluded more or less the same thing, that the unrest was as much about systemic discrimination and inequity as it was the specific case of Lino Rivera. The biracial commission of investigation, appointed by New York's mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, called for increased access to health care, better schools, and vocational training, access to better housing, and improved relationships between police officers and black residents of Harlem as its prescription for preventing another riot. The relatively unimportant case of juvenile pilfering would never have taken on the significance which it later took on had not a fortuitous combination of subsequent events made it the spark which set aflame the smoldering resentments of the city of Harlem against racial discrimination and poverty in the midst of many, the Commission wrote in its review. The security of the individual in Harlem against police aggression is one of the most potent causes for the existing hostility to authority. Another report, titled The Negro in Harlem, a report on social and economic conditions responsible for the outbreak of March 19, 1935, concluded that the unrest came as the result of the accumulating effect of, quote, injustices of discrimination in employment, the aggressions of the police, and the racial segregation, end quote. Those who have studied the 1935 Harlem riot say that while the underlying issues in the neighborhood spoke to deep systemic inequality, it was perceived disregard and devaluation of the black body and of black life that called forth the rage that enveloped the black body of men and women, or the black men and women of Harlem on that day. The same can be said for the violence in Ferguson. Those who set fire to the Quick Trip and who smashed the windows of Sam's Meat Market and Red's Barbecue did so, at least in part, out of communal rage over the death of Mike Brown. Yet, were it not for the deep and abiding inequality through which the black residents of Ferguson lived their lives, it is unclear if those blocks of Ferguson would ever have burst into flames. The Harlem Riot of 1935, now the subject of a comprehensive report, demonstrated that the Negro is not merely the man who shouldn't be forgotten, he is the man who cannot be safely ignored. The writer and philosopher Alain Locke, the first Black Rhodes Scholar, wrote in 1936, 11 brief years ago, Harlem was full of the thrill and the ferment of sudden progress and prosperity. Today, with that same Harlem prostrate in the grip of the depression and throes of social unrest, we confront the sobering facts of a serious relapse and premature setback. Indeed, find it hard to believe that the rosy enthusiasms and hopes of 1925 were more than brilliant illusions or a cruelly deceptive mirage. Yet, after all, there was a Renaissance with its poetic spurt of cultural and spiritual advance, vital with significant but uneven accomplishments. What we face in Harlem today is the first scene of the next act, a prosy ordeal of the Reformation with its stubborn task of economic reconstruction and social and civic reform. Decades after the 1935 Harlem riot, and yet decades before Ferguson, James Baldwin, who grew up on the same Harlem streets, warned that there would be more of this brand of unrest, invoking biblical imagery to remind a nation then grappling with the civil rights movement that a just God had promised that his next judgment on an unjust world would come by in flames, not water. Baldwin wrote in 1963, "If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the other, do not falter out in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and believe our country and achieve our country and change the world. Now, if we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible and sung by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time." By the time the sun rose over Ferguson on August 11th, 2 days after Mike Brown's death, the Quick Trip gas station would be nothing more than charred remains. The large metal post that once displayed the red and white QT logo now declared the QT People's Park, liberated 8/10/14 in black spray paint. More than 2 dozen friends and family members attended an afternoon press conference at the Jennings Mason Temple Church in St. Louis, where the forceful words of civil rights attorney Ben Crump echoed off the wooden fixtures and at times rattled the stained glass windows. This was my first stop after arriving in St. Louis on the afternoon of August 11th, 2 days after Mike Brown had been killed. The press conference was just beginning as I found my way up the stairs to the second floor sanctuary, sliding into a pew behind the local news cameraman and grabbing a seat between two correspondents for MSNBC. It was a scene we had all, unfortunately, grown familiar with. A grieving family with t-shirts reading Rest in Peace would step up to the microphone to demand justice, knowing how unlikely it would be that they would get it. I'd been in this room before. Midway through an internship at the Boston Globe, I'd been dispatched to the scene of a police shooting of a young black man. Officers said he had fled on foot after a traffic stop, then pulled a gun on them. The investigation into the killing took well over a year, and the slain man's mother had taken to the community meetings to confront police officials, sobbing and pleading with them to give her the name of the officer who had killed her son. I'd sit with my head angled down as I listened to her desperate cries. Knowing that a police officer is responsible causes a special, deep pain for the families of those killed, because the person who gunned down their loved one was not a mythical bad guy, not a gangbanger or a thug or a random criminal. For the families of those killed by the police, it is often the most shattering that their loved one was killed by the very people sworn to protect them. A family and a community's fundamental understanding of safety and security in our society is threatened when those pledged to protect kill. Similar cries, the frantic gasp of a mother now without her child, were coming from the back of the sanctuary as Mike Brown's family made their way to the microphone. Immediately, I found myself with a small but consequential logistical decision to make. I was armed with a notebook, a phone, and my two hands. In most cases, I would opt to record audio with my phone while taking notes by hand, but that would mean not sending real-time updates on a story where a national audience was hungry for new information. So I opted against recording. This was a story that had played out on social media. I reasoned that this was where my reporting efforts should continue to focus for now. I'd use my phone to send tweets and take notes by hand, even if it meant I'd end up with a more disjointed and incomplete set of direct quotations. He was executed in broad daylight when it was clear he had no weapon, declared Crump, a Florida-based attorney who was first thrust into the national spotlight when he represented the family of Trayvon Martin. Their baby was executed in broad daylight, he yelled. Crump said that Martin's father had called the Brown family before listing name after name of young black men gunned down in controversial shootings in recent years. Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Jonathan Ferrell. Those names represented the first wave of Black death to come during the Obama administration, a series of shootings joined by that of Oscar Grant, the subject of a police shooting that occurred in 2009 but drew sustained national attention in 2013 after being depicted in the film Fruitvale Station, that brought new urgency to the peril of black life. To some, it has become a cliche. To us, these are our children, Crump declared, voice booming. Our children. Don't they deserve the dignity and respect of law enforcement? Mike Brown's mother stepped up to the microphone, overcome with emotion as members of her family wailed in the sanctuary's front row. All sides along the room sat friends of their family, their shirts declaring no justice, no peace. Unable to deliver her prepared remarks, Leslie McSpadden said she would have been overjoyed to drop her son off at college. Mike Brown, having finally completed the summer course he needed to get his high school diploma, was supposed to be starting his classes at a vocational school that very day. Instead, McSpadden said she was planning his burial. "That was my firstborn son. Ask anyone, and they'd tell you how much I loved my son. I just wish I could have been there to help him. My son. I just wish I could have been there to help him, my son," she murmured before breaking down in tears, lifting her hands. As tears dropped onto the podium, she added, "No violence, just justice." At the end of the service, I slipped out in front of the family, hoping to catch one or two of them as they made their way to their cars. But they were overcome, the pain of the death still fresh. As they neared the exit, Brown's grandmother, with whom for a time he had lived, fell to the ground as she wailed, "Oh God, they took my baby!" Tears were bursting from her eyes as she was carried toward a car. Moments later, I found Charles Ewing, one of Brown's uncles and a local pastor, who insisted to me that there was no way his nephew would have attacked a police officer. We called him the Gentle Giant. He was a gentle giant.